Before I tell you this one, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think of the quietest person you've ever known. The one who never raised a hand, never raised a voice, who you'd have walked right past on the street and never thought twice about. Now imagine that person was carrying something for 18 years, something that could have saved lives, and instead almost cost them their own. That's who this story is about. A woman who folded herself down small enough to disappear because the one time her family let the world see what they could do, the world hanged them for it. I'm not going to tell you she was a saint. She wasn't. She was scared and stubborn, and she made a choice that night that I still don't know was the right one. But I was there. I saw the moment everything came apart. And if you stay with me to the end of the second part, I promise you'll understand why, 20 years later, I still can't tell this story without my hands going still. So settle in. Let me take you back. He child was turning blue, and not one of us could do a thing about it. I want you to picture it the way I had to live it. A single room above the dry goods store in Harlow, Arizona territory, lit by 2 lamps because somebody had thought to bring a second one up the stairs. The air thick enough to chew sweat and tallow, and the sour-sweet rot of sickness that had been moving through our town for 19 days. On the bed, a girl of 6 named Pearl Thorne, propped up on 3 pillows because lying flat made it worse, her little chest heaving like a bellows that had a hole in it. And that sound, Lord, that sound, a crowing, scraping wheeze every time she pulled for air, the kind of noise that gets into the soft part of your brain and lives there. Folks back then called diphtheria the strangling angel. Standing in that room, I understood the name down to my boots. Doc Prout was on his knees by the bed with his sleeves rolled and his hands shaking, and Doc Prout's hands did not shake. He had set my own collarbone once without so much as a flicker. But that night, his fingers trembled over a child whose throat had grown a gray skin across the inside of it, a membrane thick as wet leather, and there was not one blessed thing in his black bag that could cut through it before she suffocated. He knew it. We all knew it. Pearl's mother, Ruth, was making a sound that I have spent 20 years trying to forget. Not a scream. Screaming would have been easier to hear, but a low, broken humming, rocking on her heels in the corner with her fist pressed against her own mouth. And by the doorway, half in shadow, stood a woman that nobody in that room was looking at. Wren Calder, our seamstress, the quiet one. I was looking at her, though. I'd been looking at her for the better part of an hour, ever since she'd come up those stairs uninvited with her sewing basket on her arm like she had some legitimate errand, which she did not, and pressed herself into the corner where the lamplight didn't reach. I'd known Wren most of her life. I'd watched her grow from a skinny, watchful child into a skinny, watchful woman, and in all those years I had never once seen her face do what it was doing now. Her jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle jumping under her ear. Her right hand was buried in the pocket of her apron, gripping something, and her knuckles had gone white as bone. She was looking at that suffocating child the way a person looks at a fire they started years ago and thought they'd put out. I knew what was in her pocket. That's the part I have to make you understand before I go any further. I knew, and I said nothing, and I had been saying nothing for a very long time. My name is Ezra Hale. I ran cattle and traded horses out on the flats east of Harlow for the better part of 40 years, and I am the man telling you this because I am the only one left who saw the whole shape of it, the beginning and the middle and the end. I'll be honest about my failings as we go. I have a habit when I'm nervous of counting things. Always have. Fence posts, the buttons on a man's coat, the number of times a clock ticks between one hard thought and the next. I kept a little leather tally book in my breast pocket for 30 years and filled the margins with sums that meant nothing to anybody but me. My late wife used to say I'd count the stars down out of the sky if you gave me a long enough night. That night above the dry goods store, I counted Pearl Thorne's breaths. I got to 41 before they started coming further apart, and that's when the counting stopped helping. So let me set it down plain, the way I'd want somebody to set it down for me. Harlow wasn't much. A church, a saloon that pretended to be a hotel, a smithy, the dry goods store, two streets that turned to soup when the rains came and to bone dust when they didn't. We were close enough to the Slateback Hills that the Apache bands moved through our country regular, and I traded with one of those bands for the best part of my life, which is a thing that made me peculiar in the eyes of my neighbors and which I'll come back to, because it matters. We were the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and that sounds like a comfort, and sometimes it was, and sometimes it was the worst thing about the place. Because a town like that has a long memory. A town like that does not let a thing go. And the thing Harlow had not let go of, in 18 years, was Cora Calder. Cora was Wren's mother, and to tell you about Wren I have to tell you about Cora, though it costs me something to do it. She came to Harlow when I was a young man of 20, a widow with a little girl and away with sickness that nobody could account for. She wasn't a doctor. There wasn't a doctor in 50 miles back then. She was just a woman who knew things. She knew which weed pulled a fever down and which one you boiled for a cough and which mushroom would stop a man's heart, though she only ever spoke of that last one as a warning. She set bones. She pulled bobbies into the world that would have died otherwise, and their mothers along with them. For a few years there, Cora Calder was the most quietly important person in our county, and I think she knew it, and I think she was careful with it, and I think being careful with it is exactly what undid her. Because in the spring of the year I turned 22, a man named Loomis took sick with a swelling in his gut, and Cora sat with him 3 nights running, and on the 4th night Loomis died. And his brother stood up in the churchyard and said she'd poisoned him. Said he'd seen her grinding something dark in a bowl. Said his brother had been hale as a horse till she got her hands on him. None of it was true, or at least none of it was true the way he meant it. Loomis had a thing growing in his belly that would have killed him whether Cora came or not, and any honest soul could see she'd only been trying to ease his going. But the man who took that accusation and sharpened it and drove it through the whole town like a nail wasn't the brother. It was Deacon Elias Thorne. Yes, Pearl's grandfather, the same name. You're ahead of me and you're right to be. Thorne was a big man in Harlow in those days, the kind of big that comes from being certain about everything and afraid of one thing. And the thing Elias Thorne was afraid of was a woman who could do what the men of God could not. He preached 3 Sundays running about witches and the gifts that come from below, and he never once said Cora's name, which was worse than if he had, because it let every frightened person in those pews put her face to the word. By the end of that month they had decided what she was. And on a gray morning in May, 18 years before that child lay strangling above the dry goods store, they put a rope over the limb of the big cottonwood by the dry fork, and they hanged Cora Calder for a murder she did not commit. I was there. I want to be honest with you because this whole story turns on honesty, and I'd be a coward to leave it out. I stood in that crowd, 22 years old, and I watched, and I did not say a word. I knew she hadn't done it. I'd seen Loomis's belly with my own eyes a week before I'd helped carry him to his bed. I knew. And I held my tongue because Thorne was powerful and I was nobody, and because it is a terrible easy thing to believe that somebody else will speak up so you don't have to. Nobody did. We let it happen. And the last thing I saw before I turned my horse around and rode home sick to my stomach was a little girl of 10 years old being held back from the cottonwood by 2 women, her mouth open and no sound coming out of it, her face turned up toward the thing they were doing to her mother. That little girl was Wren. She didn't leave Harlow. That's the thing that always undid me about her. A child watches her mother hanged by a town. And you'd think she'd run from that town the first chance she got and never look back. Wren stayed. The widow Prout, Doc's mother, who was a decent woman in a town that had run short on decency, took her in and raised her, and Wren grew up among the very people who'd killed her mother, and she grew up quiet. That's the only word for it. She made herself small. She kept her eyes down. She learned to sew, and she sewed beautifully. And she said please and thank you, and she never, ever, in 18 years, let a single soul see that she had inherited one solitary scrap of what her mother could do. But she had, I knew she had, and here is how I knew. I told you I traded with the Apache band that moved through the Slateback country. The woman I dealt with most, the one who'd come down to the flats with hides and turquoise and a hard eye for a fair price. The settlers called her Lupe, and that was a name she let us use and not her own name, which she kept, the way she kept most things that were hers. Lupe was a healer among her own people, and a finer one than any white doctor I ever met, and she had a tongue on her that could strip the bark off a tree. We weren't friends, exactly. I'm not sure she'd have used the word, and I'm not sure she'd have been wrong not to, but over 20 years of horse trading and weather and the small, grim news that travels between people who share a hard country, we came to something. A respect. A way of being easy in each other's quiet. And one afternoon, when Wren was maybe 16, I rode up into the Slatebacks to settle a price on 2 mares, and I came over a rise, and there in the shade of a juniper sat Lupe with a clutch of dried plants spread on a blanket, and sitting across from her, listening with her whole body the way she never listened to anybody in town, was Wren Calder. I pulled my horse up. Wren went white. Lupe looked at me with that flat, measuring look she had, and she said in her careful English, "He counts things. He doesn't tell things." And then she went right back to what she was teaching, as if I were a fence post that had wandered into the conversation. She was right on both counts. I didn't tell. For 12 years I didn't tell. I watched Wren slip out of town in the gray hours and come back with dirt on her hem, and I watched Lupe pass things to her wrapped in cloth, and I watched a hanged woman's daughter quietly become the most knowledgeable healer in the whole territory, while the town that murdered her mother went right on thinking she was nothing but a mouse with a needle. I think Lupe taught her partly out of pity and partly out of something flintier than pity, a sense that knowledge shouldn't die just because a town was afraid of it. And Wren learned it all. She just never used it. 18 years, she carried it folded up inside her like a letter she'd promised herself she would never send. Because she'd made a vow, you see. I learned that later. The morning they hanged her mother, that 10-year-old child had sworn to herself that whatever was in her blood, whatever had gotten Cora killed, she would bury so deep that nobody would ever find it. She would not be her mother. She would not give Harlow the rope to hang her with. She'd watched what the gift did to the person who used it, and she had decided, at 10 years old, that she would rather let it rot in her than die for it. And for 18 years she kept that vow. She let people sicken, and she kept her hands in her pockets. I don't say that to make her cold, Lord, the opposite. I say it because I want you to understand the size of the thing she was holding back. Every fever, every birth gone wrong, every child that the strangling angel took before this one, Wren knew things that might have helped, and she watched, and she stayed quiet, and every single time it must have torn a strip off her soul. That's the cost nobody saw. The quiet ones are always paying for something. We just don't bother to ask what. The sickness that came to Harlow that autumn was the worst we'd ever seen. It started with the Petrie children out on the South Road, and it moved into town like a tide coming in, slow and certain and impossible to push back. Doc Prout did what he could, which by then was not much. He was an old man, and tired, and he'd started keeping a bottle in his desk drawer the way tired old men in hard places do. The strangling angel took 4 children in those 19 days before it ever got to Pearl Thorne. I dug 2 of the graves myself, because there's a limit to how much grief a town can do with its hands, and somebody has to do the rest. It was a cruel kind of irony, what happened next, and I've never been able to decide whether the world arranges these things on purpose or whether we just notice the shape of them after. Because the sickness, which respected no fence and no fortune, walked right up the steps of the finest house in Harlow and laid its gray hand on the throat of Elias Thorne's only grandchild. Thorne was an old man himself by then, stooped, his certainty curdled into something meaner but still the kind of man a town listens to. And when his Pearl took sick, he did what powerful frightened men do. He gathered everyone he could into that little room and the street below it, as if a crowd could shame death into letting go. There must have been 30 people on the stairs and in the street that night, praying, watching. Some of them, I'd wager, just there because they couldn't bear to be alone with their own fear. And somewhere in all that gathering, the word went out, the Thorn child is dying. The doctor can't save her. And it traveled down the streets and into the small dark house at the end of town, where a seamstress sat at her window with a vow 18 years old going brittle in her chest. I don't know what made her come. I've thought about it 1,000 times. The child of the man who'd hanged her mother, choking to death not a quarter mile away. God knows there were people in that town who'd have said it was justice, who'd have sat by their own windows and let the Thorns taste a little of what they dished out. Wren had more reason than anyone alive to stay home that night. More reason to let Elias Thorn learn exactly what it feels like to stand in a crowd and watch someone you love die while you do nothing. But she put on her shawl. She picked up her sewing basket because she needed a reason, and that was the only one she had. And she walked up that quarter mile in the cold, and she climbed those stairs, and she pressed herself into the dark corner of that lamplit room. To watch. Just to watch, I think, at first. The way you press on a sore tooth. That's where I found her. That's where this story started, with the two of us in the shadows and the strangling angel doing its slow work on a 6-year-old girl, and Doc Prute's hands shaking, and Ruth Thorn humming her broken hum in the corner. I want to tell you about the next part the way it happened, second by second, because the whole of 2 lives turned inside the space of about half a minute, and I don't want to cheat you of any of it. Pearl arched on the bed. Her little hands clawed at the air. The crowing sound she'd been making, that awful crowing, stopped. Not because she was better, because she couldn't make it anymore. She couldn't pull enough air past that gray membrane to even make the noise. Her eyes went wide and rolled toward her mother, and her lips were the color of a winter sky. Doc Prute sat back on his heels. I watched him do it. I watched the fight go out of him. He said to no one in a voice like a door closing, "There's nothing I can't," and he didn't finish it. He looked down at his own useless trembling hands and he stopped. And Ruth Thorn understood what that meant, and she came up off the floor and across that room, and she got down over her daughter's body and she started to keen. I happened to be looking at Wren when it happened. I will be grateful for that one accident of position for the rest of my life, because it means I am the only living soul who saw her face in the half-second before she moved. I saw the vow break. I genuinely did. I saw 18 years of no go to war with 1 second of something older than the vow, something her mother had put in her before any of this, and I saw which one won. It didn't win pretty. Her whole face crumpled like she was the one who couldn't breathe, and then it went smooth. Smooth and certain and terribly, terribly calm. Her hand came out of her apron pocket. I knew what was in it. I told you I knew. She'd been carrying it for years, the way some folks carry a Bible or a lucky coin, a thin reed, hollowed and cut and kept clean, the length of a finger. A thing Lupe had taught her to make and Lupe had taught her to use, for exactly one purpose, on exactly the kind of throat that was closing in that bed. Wren took 1 step out of the dark corner and into the lamplight. And in that 1 step, that single step across a wooden floor with 30 frightened people praying around her, Wren Calder stopped being the quiet seamstress, stopped being the mouse with the needle, stopped being the small safe nothing she had spent 18 years building over the truth of herself, like a person building a house over a grave. Elias Thorn saw her coming, and the first thing his face did was the thing I'll never be able to scrub out of my memory. It wasn't grief, though his grandchild lay dying 3 feet from him. It wasn't even surprise. For 1/2 of 1 second before fear caught up with him, the old deacon's mouth twisted into the beginning of the same look he'd worn 18 years before in that churchyard, the look of a man who has just been handed proof of everything he ever wanted to believe. There, you see. The witch's daughter, I told you what she was. And then he saw the reed in her hand and the certainty in her eyes. And the look died, because somewhere underneath all that poison, the man understood that the only person in the room who could keep his Pearl alive was the one person he had spent his life teaching the town to hate. "Don't you," he started, "don't you put your hands on her." Wren didn't even look at him. I have seen brave men in my time. I've seen a cowhand walk back into a burning barn for a horse that wasn't worth the leather on its bridle. I have never in my life seen anything braver than Wren Calder ignoring Elia's thorn. She crossed the last of that floor. She went down on her knees by the bed where Doc Prude had just given up, and she put 2 fingers against the child's throat, gentle, gentle, the way you'd touch a bird's egg, and she found the place. She'd found it 100 times in her mind, I'd wager. Lupe had made her find it on a deer carcass, on her own neck, on a rag doll, until the place lived in her fingertips. And then she said, without turning around, in a voice so steady it frightened me worse than any shout could have, "Hold her still, somebody hold her still." Nobody moved, 30 people and nobody moved. So I did. I came out of the corner and I knelt down across from her and I put my hands on that little girl's shoulders, and Wren looked up at me one time, just one, and I have spent 20 years trying to name what was in that look. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more like, so this is it then. The bill come due. The thing she'd run from her whole life, arriving at last, and her too tired and too far in to run any more. What she did next I won't lay out for you stroke by stroke, partly because it's not a thing that needs describing and partly because, even now, the memory of it makes my own throat close. I'll tell you only that her hands did not shake. Doc Prute's hands, a trained man's hands, had been shaking for an hour. Wren's hands, the hands of a seamstress, a woman who'd never been allowed to so much as admit she knew which end of a wound to clean, those hands moved like they'd been waiting her whole life for permission. One small, sure motion. The reed going where it needed to go, past the gray strangling skin, into the open dark beneath it. And then there was a sound in that room that I will hear on my deathbed. It was air, just air. A thin, wet, whistling rush of it, in and out, through the reed and into a pair of lungs that had been an instant from quitting. Pearl Thorne's chest, which had stopped heaving, lifted. Her color, I watched it happen, I will swear to it before any god you care to name, her color came back. The winter sky blue drained out of her lips and the pink came up underneath it like a sunrise, and her eyes, which had rolled back, came forward again and found her mother. Ruth Thorne stopped keening. The whole room stopped breathing, as though we'd all traded our breath to the child and were waiting to see if she'd give it back. Wren sat back on her heels. Her face was gray as ash and shining with sweat, and there were tears running clean down it, though I don't think she knew they were there. Her hands, finally, now that the work was done, now they began to shake. I have thought a great deal about silence in the years since. There's a kind that's empty and there's a kind that's so full it weighs on you, and the silence in that room after the child took her first clean breath was the second kind. It went on a long time, 10 seconds maybe, long enough for me to count Pearl's breaths up to 12, easy ones, even ones, each one a small miracle repeating itself. And in that silence, every person in that room had to decide what they had just seen. That's the part nobody tells you about a moment like that. You think the drama is in the doing. It isn't. The drama is in the after, in the half-minute when 30 frightened people stand at a fork in the road and choose, all at once and each alone, which story they're going to believe. They could believe they had just watched a woman save a child's life with skill and courage. Or they could believe the old story, the comfortable one, the one Elia's thorn had spent a generation feeding them, that the witch's daughter had her hands on a child and dark things were afoot. Both stories fit the same set of facts. That's the terrible thing about people. The facts almost never decide it. The fear does. I watched them choose. I watched it move across the room like wind across a wheat field. The Petrie woman who'd lost her own boy to the angel 2 weeks before put her hand over her mouth and started to weep, and it was the good kind of weeping, the kind that says thank God somebody finally beat it. That was one story taking hold. But over by the window, old Marsh and his wife had drawn back against the wall, and Marsh had 2 fingers crossed down at his side where he thought nobody could see, the old sign against the evil eye. That was the other story. Both of them in the same room in the same minute. And Elia's thorn stood between the two of them, and the whole town leaned toward whichever way he'd fall. He looked at his granddaughter. He looked at the steady rise and fall of her chest. And then he looked at the woman kneeling on his floor, Cora Calder's child, the living image of the woman he'd hanged, the proof of his sin breathing in front of him, and I watched Elias Thorne open his mouth to speak. And I did not know, I swear to you I did not know, which story was about to come out of it. What came out was nothing. He couldn't do it. I'll give him that much. And it's the only thing I'll ever give him. He stood there with his jaw working and no sound, the same way his town had stood silent in a churchyard 18 years before while an innocent woman died, and now the silence was his, and he choked on it the way his grandchild had choked on the membrane. And in the end the old deacon turned his face away from Wren Calder and could not say a single word, for good or ill. It was Doc Prout who broke it. He'd been kneeling there the whole time, forgotten, watching a woman with no training do the thing his training couldn't, and when he finally spoke his voice cracked like a boy's. He said, "Where did you learn that?" Not a question, hardly. A sound a man makes when the floor's gone out from under everything he thought he knew. And Wren, gray, shaking, exposed at last in front of the whole world after 18 years of hiding, Wren looked up at him and gave him the truth. All of it. She didn't dress it up and she didn't beg pardon for it. "My mother," she said, "and then a woman in the hills who was kinder to me than this town ever was." Then she stood up. Her knees nearly went out from under her, and I caught her elbow and she let me, just for a second, and then she straightened and pulled away because she would be damned before she'd be seen needing anybody in that room. She looked around at all of them, at the weeping Petrie woman and the crossed fingers and the silent, ruined old man. And she said the only other thing she said that night, quiet, almost gentle, which was worse than any shout could have been. "You can keep the Reed in for a day. Then send for me or send for the doctor and we'll see her the rest of the way through. A breath. I'll be at my house, where I have been the whole time." Where I have been the whole time. 18 years those 4 words held. I have been right here. I have been your seamstress and your neighbor and the quiet woman you walked past, and the whole time I could have done this, and I didn't, because you taught a 10-year-old girl that the price of helping you was a rope. She didn't say all that. She said where I have been the whole time, and she picked up her sewing basket, because she'd carried it up and by God she'd carry it back down, and she walked out and down the stairs and into the cold. And the crowd parted for her like she was made of fire. Pearl Thorne lived. I should say that plainly because the rest of what I have to tell is hard, and you deserve the good news held up where you can see it. The child lived. Wren went back the next day and the day after, and between her hands and Doc Prout's humbled willingness to learn from them, Pearl came all the way back, and the last I knew she grew up and married a freighter and had 4 children of her own out near Tucson. A whole life. 4 more lives after that and their lives after them. That all hung on one woman's broken vow and one step out of a dark corner. I think about that sometimes when the arithmetic of the world seems to come out to nothing. One step, look what it carried. But I told you a town like Harlow has a long memory and does not let a thing go, and I won't lie to you about how it went after. It went both ways at once, is the truth, and it never fully resolved, which is how most real things go. There were folks, more than I'd have guessed, who came around. The Petrie woman left a basket of eggs on Wren's step every week for a year and never once knocked, just left them, which was that woman's whole heart said in eggs. Mothers who'd never given Wren the time of day started finding reasons to bring their sick children by. Doc Prout, to his lasting credit, did something I didn't think an old man had it in him to do. He changed. He started asking Wren what she thought. He started saying out loud in the saloon that the 2 of them together had pulled half the town's children through that winter, and he didn't care where she'd learned it. An old man admitting a younger woman knew things he didn't in that time, in that place. That took a kind of courage they don't put on monuments. But there were the others. There always are. Old Marsh never uncrossed his fingers, in a manner of speaking. There were people who took Wren's help when their child was burning up and then crossed the street from her the following Sunday, which is a particular kind of cowardice that I find harder to forgive than open hate. And there was a faction, small but loud, who decided that a woman who could pull a child back from the strangling angel was a woman who'd made a bargain to do it, and who kept Elias Thorne's old sermons alive in low voices, and who watched Wren the way you watch a storm building on the horizon. She lived with all of it. That's the thing about her I most want you to carry away. She didn't get a clean ending. She didn't get the town on its knees begging her pardon, and she didn't get run out either. She got the messy middle, gratitude and fear in the same week, eggs on the step and crossed fingers in the pew, a life of being needed by people who were still half afraid of her. And she stayed. God knows why she stayed. I asked her once, years later. She said somebody has to be here when the next one can't breathe. That was all. That was the whole reason. I have one more thing to set down, and then I'll let you go. About a month after that night, I rode up into the Slatebacks to settle accounts with Lupe's band before the cold drove them south, and I told her what had happened. Though I'd have wagered she already knew, news of that kind travels the high country faster than it travels the roads. She listened the way she always did, which was like the listening cost her nothing and was worth everything. When I finished, she was quiet a while. Then she said a thing I've never forgotten. She said, I did not teach her to use it, I taught her to carry it. There is a difference. A thing you carry you can set down once when it matters and it will not break you. She looked off toward the town we couldn't see from up there. She set it down for one breath. Now she will pick it up again. That is harder. To pick it up after knowing what it costs every day, that is the brave thing. The one night anyone frightened enough can do. I've turned that over for 20 years and I think she was right. And I think it's the truest thing anybody ever said about Wren Calder. The night above the dry goods store was the moment that exposed everything, her gift, the town's old sin, the truth about her mother that some of us had buried in our own silence. But the courage that mattered wasn't the one step into the lamplight. It was every gray dawn after, when she opened her door to people who'd have watched her hang the way they'd watched her mother, and she helped them anyway, and she went to bed and got up and did it again. As for me, I told you I'd be honest about my failings, and there's one more I owe you. A week after Pearl lived, I stood up in the saloon, where the worst of the low talk went on, and I said the thing I should have said 18 years before in a churchyard. I said I'd seen Loomis's belly with my own eyes. I said Cora Calder never poisoned anybody. I said we hanged an innocent woman because a frightened man told us to, and that her daughter had just saved one of our children, and that if there was any witchcraft in the whole sorry business, it was the kind men work with their tongues in a pulpit. It didn't undo anything. You can't unhang a woman. But Wren heard about it, and the next time I passed her on the street she stopped, and she looked at me, really looked, the way she'd looked at me over Lupe's blanket all those years before, and she nodded. Once that was all, that was everything. Elias Thorne died the following spring. They say at the end he asked for Wren and she came, because of course she came. Somebody has to be there when the next one can't breathe, even when the next one is the man who hanged your mother. I wasn't in the room. I don't know what passed between them. I've made my peace with not knowing. Some things aren't ours to overhear. She lived a long time, Wren did. Longer than I had any right to. And I'd like to tell you that the town finally, fully understood what it had in her, that they came around all the way, that the eggs and the crossed fingers settled out into something clean and good. But I started this by promising you the truth, and the truth is I don't know that they ever did. People are slow and frightened, and they hold their old stories close. What I know is that a woman spent 18 years making herself small enough to survive a town that had murdered her mother, and that in one breath she became too large for that town to ever fold her back down again, and that she paid for it every single day after, and that she never once, that I saw, wished she'd kept her hands in her pockets. The last time I saw her she was old and I was older, sitting on her step in the long gold light, and a young mother was coming up the road with a feverish baby on her hip, hurrying, the way they always hurried to Wren's door by then. And Wren got up off that step. Slow. Her knees were bad by then. She got up, and she went inside to put the kettle on, and she left the door standing open behind her so the woman could come in. I think about that open door more than I think about the reed, or the lamplight, or the breath.